Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Capitalist Cast. Joining me this morning is author and climate contrarian, Mr. Gregory Wrightstone, who I've had the privilege to know for quite a few years. Greg, would you mind just kind of giving people a little bit of background on you as well as the books that you've written?
Yeah, I'm a geologist, lifelong Pennsylvania resident. I wrote my first book, my debut book is Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. And it got the #1 bestseller on Amazon last March. We stayed right #1, #2 in several categories until this March, whenever COVID hit for some reason, it fell down. But I'm working on my second book. I'm challenged time-wise. I'm also just joined the CO2 Coalition in Arlington, West Virginia, and that's where I'm speaking from today. I'll be there. I'll taking over as the executive director of the CO2 Coalition in January. Just an impressive group of scientists, some of the top climate scientists in the world. We got Richard Lindzen from MIT, Will Happer from Princeton, atmospheric physicists, climatologists. You might know the name Pat Michaels. Patrick Moore is a YouTube legend, co-founder of Greenpeace. So I'm working with all these people. I want to be the tip of the spear to get the scientific information out there.
So we oftentimes hear this, kind of made up 98% of climate, or 98% of scientists agree about climate change being the, yada, yada, yada. Can you kind of quickly debunk that and then give us a little bit of an explanation as to what the CO2 Coalition is going to be up to?
Yeah, well, there's probably a 97% consensus on some things. We all agree that the Earth's atmosphere has warmed a little bit, 1.2 degrees maybe, since 1900. That's nothing to be alarmed about. Particularly when we see temperature ranges of 50 and 40 degrees between coldest and warmest, even on a daily basis. So we all agree on that. We all agree that CO2 is increasing, and that most of us agree that increase in CO2 is man-made from mainly the burning of fossil fuels. And I also believe that it leads to a slight increase, a modest increase in temperature because it's a greenhouse gas. But we believe that most of the temperature increase that we've seen and that we may see in the future is part of the natural process that's been happening since time immemorial. And that's what the CO2 Coalition is about. We just published a new one today by Dr. Richard Lindzen and John Christie, two atmospheric physicists, some of the top in the world. They're actually looking, this one this morning was published, it was called the global mean temperature, the average temperature of the Earth. You go, what? How do you measure the average temperature of the Earth? It might be -32 in Antarctica on the same day that it's 115 degrees in Algeria in the Sahara. So what they're doing is taking this wide range of data, averaging it, and conglomerating. It's a fascinating take that they did on this. And then we're also fighting some of the policy differences, some of these destructive and economically harmful things that we see going on, like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in Pennsylvania. These things are bad, and they're using I look at these false narratives, the false and the misinformation that's being put out to justify increasing taxation on fossil fuels. They're doing it to artificially lift up the renewables to make them look more economically competitive, which they're not, without these subsidies and penalties on fossil fuel.
Yeah, that gives us a great segue. What is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative for folks who aren't familiar with it?
I think there are 10 or 11, maybe 12 states in the Northeast that have banded together. And what it is, it's a cap and trade proposal. And by that, I mean, they figure out how much carbon dioxide emissions, That's the demon molecule, they tell us. That how much those carbon emissions, and they tax that and increase the cost for those emissions, and then they'll have to pay, if you will, it's like the Catholic Church before the Reformation. This is basically a purchase of indulgences for your sins, and it's our sins of emissions that we're paying for right now. So what it wants to do is increase all electricity generated by anything that creates carbon dioxide. And that means coal and natural gas. In the other words, any revenues generated from that are transferred into these approved clean coal or clean energy like wind and solar and the rest.
So this is something that Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania in particular has really been trumpeting, this regional greenhouse gas initiative. I know we've kind of been following what the legislature has been doing, and at this point, the legislature has taken a few actions to try and prevent the governor from entering into this just via executive action. Ultimately, I mean, from what we're seeing, it's probably going to end up just kind of as a court battle to determine whether or not he actually has the authority to enter into it without legislative approval. Are you seeing the same thing, or am I kind of being pessimistic?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, neither do I play one on the radio, but
right.
From what I understand, there's a disagreement. The legislature says, no, you can't do that. And the governor says, well, yes, I can. And it may well go to the state Supreme Court, and we know how that's going to end. We saw, politicization of the state Supreme Court. So Governor Wolf thinks he has that ability. It is, after all, a crisis, an existential crisis that we're facing, according to him. And he's created a whole laundry list of false allegations of what climate change is, how it's harming the community in the state of Pennsylvania and its citizens.
So what are some of the allegations that he's making, and then what are the facts? What is the reality?
Yeah, he's implying or imposing these justifications. We can look at the economics, and you and I and any of your listeners that are listening will agree that it has to be economically harmful to the state. Anytime you increase the cost for anything for the citizens, it's going to be painful. We saw that in the RGGI states with companies, high energy intensive companies that could flee those states, did flee those states. Now, the proponents of RGGI say, well, look at all these states, they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, if you take energy intensive companies that are creating things and then emitting carbon dioxide by those emissions, and they leave, well, yeah, your emissions are going to decline at the harm of the citizens and the economy of the state. And it's not good. And so he's using, so we agree that it would be economically harmful. And then he's saying, and this is why we need to do it, because of these physical climate change effects. There were three of them mainly he's listed. The primary was flooding and increased precipitation. And in 2019, when he first rolled this out, he was looking back. 2018 had set a record. It did for precipitation. I think it goes back to 1900 or early 1900s. So yeah, we set a precipitation record in 2018, and 2019 was above average. This year, 2020 is on pace to be significantly below average. So what he's doing, he's confusing weather and climate, and what he's conflating the two. So what he took was an aberration. It's not a long-term climate change related trend. The other thing.
So what's the difference between weather and climate? Can you clarify that for people, just so they have an understanding of what that is?
Sure, it's really easy to explain. If it's harmful, it's climate change. Anything that's beneficial is weather, is what is really what it comes down to. Now, weather is a short term. It's usually, you need to have things in a cycle or trend. They usually look at 15 or 18 years of a change to make it climate. But if we see, again, if we see anything that's beneficial, the climate alarmists say, oh, that's just weather. It's not climate. The other thing that the governor says is that pollution is increasing because of climate change. Well, it's not. And I included in my, perhaps you could link to the article I wrote. If the CO2 Coalition came out with a press release demanding that the Governor Wolf and the DEP remove their misleading information. That it's climate change misinformation. It's blatantly false, and we proved it. We attached the latest chart from the EPA that shows all 6 of the main, what they call pollutants. They include carbon dioxide in there, and we'll strongly dispute whether it's a pollutant or not. It's not. It's a miracle molecule. We see that every one of those has been in significant decline and continues to decline year after year. And the other thing they pointed to was an increase in death. Well, if we take a look at the largest studies in the world, I referenced one by Dr. Antonio Gasparini and a team of doctors that looked at 74 million temperature-related deaths around the world. And what they did was they looked at those. They found that 20 times as many people die due to cold-related deaths as they do to heat-related deaths. Another study looked at England and Wales and Australia and found out that 15 times as many people die due to cold as due to heat. So it stands to reason then that global warming and temperature increase would save lives, completely contrary to the narrative and what the governor is stating as a fact.
So when we take a look at the RGGI, or RGGI as it gets referred to, the impetus behind it is, we hear the follow the science is the rallying cry. It's actually not based in science at this point.
Absolutely not. They're taking the science and standing it on its head. We should follow the science. We should follow the science, and the governor is not. What he's doing is grabbing things out of the air, making things up, and the DEP is just supporting him with these false allegations of harm. We see that time and again. And what they're doing also is they're predicting these harmful events that will occur at 2050, 30 years in the future, or in 2100, 80 years in the future, based on failed climate models that overpredict warming. What I like to do, I live in the real world. I look at what's actually happening today. And what we find is that by every metric, almost every metric we look at, the Earth, humanity, its ecosystems are improving and benefiting. The Earth and humanity are thriving, benefiting, and prospering because of a modest increase in temperature and an increase in CO2. It's life expectancy, it's food production, crop production, just by and this goes across the board in nearly every country. We're seeing a greening of the earth with vegetation increasing.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't think about the fact that most of that plant life in general benefits from increased levels of CO2 because it gives it more food, more fuel to work with.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've called it the greatest untold story of the late 20th and early 21st century. It's this story. It's backed up by facts of an earth that's just thriving and prospering. We see in almost every single ecological niche, we see an explosion of vegetation. We see now it's warming, so we're seeing tree lines moving further north in the northern hemisphere and higher in the alpine areas. But we see actually the deserts are shrinking because of this. Because plants they're able to survive in a lower water regime with higher CO2. Just think about that. the photosynthesis, the process there. Because of more CO2, the plants aren't transpiring or breathing in and out. And that's where they lose a lot of moisture. So with increased CO2, there's a reduced need for water, and they're able to thrive in the dry areas better because of increased CO2. So we see, for example, in the southern Sahara, it's an area known as the Sahel. You can go and you can find that it's actually it's turning what was a desert into a lush grassland. People are moving back there that haven't lived there in 1,000 years. If you don't believe me, if you're going, oh, Wrightstone, you're crazy. Well, just Google NASA and greening, those two words, and see what NASA has to say. And NASA will tell you that more than 50% of the Earth is experiencing greening, if you will, increased vegetation. Less than 4% of the Earth is experiencing what they're calling browning or a loss of vegetation. That's a really, really good trade-off. Too bad if you're in that area of 4% where it's going the other way, but for the vast majority of mankind and Earth's ecosystems, it's a huge benefit. And it's just opposite of what we're being told. That's the process I want to get out there. Leo, the other thing people don't understand too is it's one of the things I'm really fascinated with. I'm in that part of the second book. As I look back through, I love correlating human history with climate and temperatures, and we see that in the past, whenever we had warming periods like we're in right now, it was a time of great prosperity and growth, and people benefited greatly. It was the cold periods that were horrific. It was a period of crop failure, pestilence, and mass depopulation. And I'm going to have to apologize, Leo. They started using a jackhammer right underneath me. Or if you hear some.
No, I can't hear it. So I think you're in pretty good shape. Your microphone's doing a good job of filtering that out. So if we come back to the Reggie, the RGGI that Governor Wolf is entering into, what we're seeing is that A, it's not backed up by science, and B, it's going to have a negative economic impact. Let's kind of circle back to that negative economic impact. Have you, and you had mentioned that there was an exodus of industry, energy intensive industry from states that had already kind of entered into the RGGI scheme. What did that look like, and do we have any idea how that's going to translate when it comes to Pennsylvania?
That's hard to say. I think we did see an exodus of those. There was a Cato, and if you don't have that report, the Cato Institute had a public policy statement on this where they looked at the Reggie states, and perhaps I can get that to you and you can post it up on your website along with our devastating takedown from the CO2 coalition, pushing back against the governors. Yeah. And so what they saw was economic stagnation and a loss of manufacturing, carbon dioxide intensive manufacturing facilities that were fleeing the state. And it would only be expected here as well. And again, this is just part of the picture. Reggie, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, is only addressing electricity generation. So that's natural gas and coal. And they love renewables. They might love renewables, but I can tell you what, the Pennsylvania Game Commission does not like renewables. In fact, they hate wind turbines. It was in 2018, they voted unanimously. And bear in mind, I think the Game Commission has 1.2 million acres. 27% of the state's identified, what do they call, factory scale wind turbine projects. Yeah. We're going to be located on Pennsylvania Game Commission properties. So these wind turbine people were just salivating over putting up wind turbines right and left on Game Commission. Because remember, the Game Commission controls a lot of those mountain ridges throughout. They're highly favorable for wind energy. And they voted 2 years, year and a half ago, to ban forever any projects. They have never had one. And the commissioners, if you would listen to their commentary, it was clear they just hated wind turbines. Some of these guys live close, in close proximity to them, and they said wind turbines are contrary to our stated goals for the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and that's to preserve and protect the resources there, and the protecting particularly the endangered species. And they clearly stated that these projects are contrary to their goals of protecting those things. So, and Pennsylvania is just not suited for solar, for any kind of. I mean, it's fine, put it up on your house, but for industrial scale solar, it's just we're too far north and it's too cloudy. I don't think
you bring up a good point about them really just being focused on electricity and energy production with the RGGI. The other piece of that is the governor is trying to get into what's known as TCI, which is the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is another thing that we've been following, and that would apply to vehicle transportation. Basically. So that would be cars, that would be transportation for trucks. All of those would essentially come under a similar kind of cap and trade, not quite cap and trade, but it would, there would be essentially an increased gas tax in order to subsidize mass transit and other things. Is the TCI, is that something that you've been looking at as well?
I've not looked. It's coming. It's the next shoe to fall. It's the next shoe to drop. I can't speak intelligently about it other than it's, their goal. Each one of these projects, their stated goal for RGGI and for the TCI, whatever that is, their goal is to increase costs for Pennsylvania citizens on certain products. In order to prop up other things to make them more competitive, and to make it more really harmful and painful to drive a gasoline or diesel powered car. They want to make it painful for you to buy electricity generated from coal, from natural gas. And it's just, here we are sitting in Pennsylvania on top of the largest gas reserve in the world by far. And Leo, I don't think people understand just how big the Marcellus Shale is. We took a look. I was the co-author of the first comprehensive paper on the Marcellus Shale. I did it with Bill Zagorski from Range Resources. We published that in 2008. And in that, we took what was called gas in place. In other words, how much gas is actually just in the ground. And we looked at it for the Marcellus Shale. There's another unknown shale that sits right above it called the Burkett. That would be a huge resource if it were located anywhere else in the world. But we looked at those two, and then we compared that to the 15 top natural gas fields in the world. And the next 14 combined equaled what the Marcellus was. Get that? So of the 15 top gas fields in the world, Marcellus was number one. The next 14 together combined equaled what the Marcellus was. And that's how big it is. We have resources we'll be producing 100 years from now. And it's just an incredible resource. And again, there's this little shale above it that anywhere else in the world, I've written about it, and it qualifies as what's called a supergiant gas field. But nobody knows about it because the Marcellus is twice as good as this other great reservoir.
Yeah.
I just heard the jackhammer go off, so I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. It's I tell you what, the one thing that's been really fascinating with everybody, kind of more people telecommuting and doing these video conferences and everything, is you really get a taste for for what real life is like for folks.
Well, and I'll tell you what, your people listening in, I'll give you a little hint. They've been jackhammering underneath me now since the beginning of our conversation. I'm using a technology. It's called CRISP, KRISP. It's a sound filtering technology. Now, you might be able to hear it now, but
Yeah.
for most of our interview, it wasn't quite this bad. And I was this is a really cool technology for your listeners. It's free, and it's a sound filtering technology. It will be, if you've got a dog in the next room that's barking, you can't hear it, and it's pretty cool. So it's called CRISP, KRISP for a year, and you just go through it, and it filters out a lot of that.
That's amazing. Well, we are coming up towards the end of the show. I know that you are working on a second book, and you had mentioned that. What is the title, or at least the working title for that?
A very convenient warming. Carbon dioxide, CO2, what was it? CO2, humanity, and history. I don't know. We're working on it, but it's dealing with. It's really a takedown of this idea of the idea that the temperatures we're in right now are unusual and unprecedented. And I start with Dr. Michael Mann from Penn State, and he continues to spread his lies and misinformation. It's just a devastating takedown of him. And then I look at the history of mankind, of this tremendous relationship between warming temperatures that have always been beneficial, and then, man, when it gets bad when it gets cold. So welcome the warmth, fear the cold. And because we've seen throughout time, the colder periods, they go by the names of the Greek Dark Ages, the Dark Ages, and the Little Ice Age. Those were times.
They don't sound very good.
They were horrific. And half the population of Iceland perished in the last one. A third of the population of the earth. Its diseases run rampant in cold weather. We see that with like COVID. During the Little Ice Age and the Dark Ages, we saw the same thing. It's just opposite of what we're being told.
If folks want to learn more about your, I know that you have a website. What's that address?
Inconvenient Facts.xyz, or go to the CO2 Coalition, co2coalition.org. If you want to do something and you don't like what you're hearing, I'm in the middle of a fundraising drive for the CO2 Coalition. Go there and send us 20 or 40 bucks. Well, a rich guy like you, Lee, I'm sure what's 10,000 probably is more up your, it's probably up your speed there. But
I wish I had that kind of money to donate to you. Believe me. So I will definitely be. When we post this video will also be posted to YouTube in addition to doing this, the Facebook Live. I will be including a couple of links. The one that you had sent me with regards to the, I think it was a DEP link, so people can, comment on entering Reggie. And I will also make sure on Facebook and on this when we get it up on Facebook to include the CO2 Coalition's takedown of what Governor Wolf has said. I really appreciate, I know you have a lot going on. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk about, the RGGI, and also just really to kind of fact check what the governor is saying as it relates to climate change. So thanks very much for coming on this morning. I appreciate it.
All right, friend, old friend. Good to talk. We'll talk again.
All right. Sounds good, buddy.